Hello everyone, this is Jesse Suter. I'm a research assistant professor at the University of Vermont, and specifically I work at the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion. I am already trying to fiddle with the microphone, and I will try not to do that. Kathleen's going to make sure I don't mess with it too much. So welcome. This is always a little difficult for me getting started because I'm presenting to a screen, so thankfully Kathleen's here, and I can get her to laugh at some of the bad jokes that I make. That'll be at least the feedback that I need. And people are saying sound is good. Wonderful. So welcome everyone. This is a title that I've stolen from another presenter, but it was just too good to pass up. This is about getting wraparound and not the runaround. So I'm going to go over our agenda in a little bit, but what I'd like you to be thinking about now is what would you like to get out of this 1 hour that we've got together? Are there questions that you have about wraparound? Is it something that you participated in before and you had a really successful experience? Is it something you participated before and you didn't have such a successful experience? I've got plenty of my slides, and I can certainly talk at everybody for an hour, but I would hate to do that. I think that would be pretty boring for me and everyone else. So just start thinking about what questions you have and kind of what your hopes and dreams are for this presentation, and then as they come to you, please write it into not the chat box, they write it into the question box. Okay, I'm giving the right instructions hopefully. So you can write those in at any time. The way I've organized this is I'll have a few pieces of information to share, and then I've got several places where I pause to check to see if anybody has questions. There's also a few times during the webinar that I'm going to ask questions of you. So hopefully folks will be able to write into the question box their answers. So before I get started, the last thing I want to do is obviously tell you a little bit more about me. Like I said, I work at CDCI. My background with Wraparound is this is an approach that I learned about when I was in graduate school working with John Burchard at the University of Vermont, who was one of, we keep calling him one of the early pioneers in Wraparound from back in the 80s when it really got going. And it was an exciting thing for me to learn about as a clinical psychology student, because I was learning about lots of mental health interventions that we could offer to kids and to a lesser extent to families as well. The most of what we were focused on was providing support, so one kid at a time. Wraparound was a completely different approach, and it was just very appealing to me, and I really saw the benefit of being able to offer the engagement and collaboration of a wraparound approach along with evidence-based interventions, and I really believe that it's the two of them that are going to lead to the best outcomes for kids and families. So that's my area. In Vermont, I am the school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports wraparound trainer. So I'll talk about that a little bit in this presentation, not very much. So if it's something you want to know more about, I can give people resources, or I can talk more about it today if there's a lot of questions around it. And then nationally, I work with the National Wraparound Initiative. So there's several other colleagues that I do research with to try and help understand wraparound better, understand what works for kids and families about wraparound, and then just really trying to get the word out about those aspects that work the best so we can really improve wraparound around the country. So there's plenty of other projects that I work on at UVM, and I will try not to bore people with all of those with the list. So let me figure out what was next here. The slide is thinking about advancing. Hang in there. There we go. Okay, so here's the agenda. So there's really just 5 things that I wanted to accomplish today. So the first one is who's here, and I'm not going to ask folks to introduce themselves, but what I will ask is I'm assuming that this is that the audience is largely parents. And so that's how I've prepared the presentation. If there's anybody that is participating in the webinar that has a different role and you'd like to share that with me just so I can think about who my audience is, feel free to type that into the question box. And so I've already told you about me, so we can check that one off the list already. Where we're going next, and this is really the biggest part of what I had prepared, is talking about just what is wraparound, because there's a lot of confusion around it, and if you remember from the title, it's really easy to get the runaround rather than wraparound. Another thing we call it is wraparound light, where people are trying to offer wraparound, but it's really not holding up to the principles and the elements that we understand it. And I see people are starting to type in other kinds of roles. Thanks for doing that. I'm also going to talk a little bit about what wraparound isn't, by emphasizing some of the ways that it's different from traditional services, and also how it's developed over time. So like I said, it's been around for a while. It's been around for a while in Vermont, but what people call wraparound and what they get can be very different things. So I'm going to try and focus primarily on what the National Wraparound Initiative has come to consensus on, are some of the key elements of it. From there, I'm going to talk a little bit about how does wraparound work, because it's always been a bit of a mystery. In fact, one of my favorite definitions of wraparound that people talk about is wraparound is what you do when you don't know what to do and you've already tried everything else, which is a really great thing to say. It's a terrible definition, and it doesn't tell you anything about how it works. So I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit, and that's, again, some of the work that the National Wraparound Initiative has done has been to understand it better. And I think that's good information for families and providers to have. From there, and this is kind of how can you avoid the runaround, what are just some strategies that you can use as a parent? And I see we do have a few providers on as well. And what are some strategies that you can use to make sure that you're not getting the runaround? And the last point here, and it's not going to be part of the webinar per se, is so Kathleen said when you're finished with the webinar today, it sounds like they're going to go to a direct link for a Vermont Family Network survey. They'll be emailed that one, or okay? So you'll I have another training evaluation that's part of our center's evaluation to make sure that we're doing a good job. I would love to get your feedback. It sounds like you're going to get an email just about a week from now, and it'll have a link to that survey. So please fill it out. I promise to use the feedback that you give me for improving webinars or trainings like this in the future. Okay. So I'm going to take just a breath and take a look at what people have typed in so far. There's speech-language pathologists, children's mental health providers. We've got health and PBIS coordinators, so who knows, there might be some questions about school then. And then I see one question already, a question for when is it appropriate? How does wellness and prevention fit with wraparound, particularly the family-based approach from the Vermont Center for Children, Youth, and Families? Fantastic question. That's something that I've talked to them only a little bit about. So hopefully when we start to compare wraparound to other kinds of approaches, you can chime in with some more specifics about that question, and we can try and unpack it. Because I will say I don't fully know the family-based approach, except that that group really wants to emphasize evidence-based interventions. And I think in general, wraparound is an excellent fit for evidence-based interventions. So I can at least talk about it on that level. And if that's not good enough, keep typing your questions and I'll try and do better. Okay, so what is wraparound? I want to start with what your knowledge is about wraparound or experience that you might have had about wraparound already. So for those of you that want to share that, I'm hoping you can type that into the question box. So we can take a look just for me to understand kind of the experiences of our audience already has. And I'm thinking I should have given people a little bit more warning that this question was coming. There's only a couple of times that I'm asking questions like this. I'll try and do a better job of giving people that warning. But this can be pretty simple. I'm just curious if there's anybody that's participated on a wraparound team in Vermont, or has provided or tried to run a wraparound team in Vermont, or if there's just some things that you've heard about wraparound that you're interested. All right, so some responses are coming in. So I'm seeing some people are saying they are providers of wraparound approach. Great. So we'll maybe have an opportunity to see to what extent the wraparound that you're offering is similar or different from some of the things that I'm describing. I'm also reading supporting some families who have wraparound or wanted to get wraparound. It seems to be confusing what it actually is. Great. You're in exactly the right place in the agenda because we're going to talk about that. And definitely the term is used in many places and is not always accurate. Okay, so if folks have other experiences or knowledge about wraparound, please feel free to type that in, and we'll keep checking the questions board as it comes up. I'm going to go ahead and start to talk about sort of nationally how we think about wraparound and see if we can't unpack this a little bit more. So this is a slide that I think every time I share it, I change it a little bit because there's so many components to wraparound, and I'm going to share the 10 principles in a minute. But it's always hard to get it down to just a single sentence or even a single paragraph about what wraparound is. So here I'm just trying to emphasize sort of 4 distinct pieces of it. So first, wraparound is not wraparound if it's not part of a team-based process. And very simply, and this is similar to a lot of other kinds of teams, it's a way of bringing people together that are involved with the family to get them working on common goals. And so the main points here are it's team-based, but it's also a process. So sometimes people talk about it as a service or a set of services or a treatment or maybe even a particular kind of funding mechanism. And wraparound can include parts of all of that. But what wraparound really is, it's an organized process that has a very specific beginning, middle, and end to it. So if it's wraparound, it is flexible and it's individualized, but that process that you go through should be the same. And there's even fidelity standards for making sure that it holds to that. And so that's why I always try and use the word process and avoid saying service or treatment. Somebody that's receiving wraparound can actually also receive lots of different treatments and services, like therapy or special education. It's not like you can have only one or the other. In fact, I think they're very complementary. The second point is that it really needs to be led and organized and delivered by a trained wraparound facilitator. And already I misspoke. It's organized and delivered by a trained wraparound facilitator, but it should be led by the family and the youth to the extent that they're able. That's something that is very distinct to a wraparound team meeting. Many kinds of team meetings have a facilitator, but sometimes it can change from meeting to meeting. It really takes a lot of skills and training in order to deliver wraparound with high fidelity. So you need to have a trained facilitator. But that trained facilitator, their primary job is to make sure that the family and youth's voice is heard, and they are getting to lead the process as much as possible. So ultimately, this is a team that comes together that they're working on a plan that's meeting the unique needs and strengths of the youth and family. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Another thing that distinguishes it from some kinds of team meetings is this is a group that needs to meet regularly to both make sure that the plan is getting done and seeing if changes need to be made to the plan. So I've participated in lots of teams that will meet once to sort of develop the plan, and then everybody breaks up and goes to do their work separately. That can work great if the needs aren't too high, but if there's been a decision that you need wraparound, usually you need to be meeting pretty regularly because things can change frequently. So I'm pausing again because I'm seeing a few other people have chimed in. So I'm seeing somebody writing, I work mostly with kids under 3 in the home. But for children on the spectrum and other medical diagnoses who are over 3, I work to provide home-based speech language assessment treatment too. Great, so learning more about some of the providers who are participating today. A couple of questions. Do wraparound teams meet when school is not in session, like during the summer? I assume the question there is for school-based wraparound teams. Wraparound can actually happen in a lot of different contexts, but that's probably a school-based question, and it's really up to each individual school. Most trained facilitators that are working in schools are school personnel, and so their job ends in the summer. One of the things that we're working on in Vermont is trying to have closer relationships between our mental health centers and our schools so they can provide a more complete or sustainable system of supports between school and the community. And I think that's a great example of how if they're working closer together, there could still be wraparound supports in the summer. And can a student of any age have wraparound team is wraparound only for students in the school setting. So I've hinted at the second one. Wraparound's definitely not only for students in the school setting. That's the training. That's the primary training that I've been offering in Vermont, has been a school-based one, specifically for schools that are doing school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports. But wraparound is an approach that has been used in juvenile justice. It's been used with child welfare, and it's been used by mental health providers. And it's been used for youth across the whole age range. And I guess one thing that I'm not going to have really a lot of time to talk about, but I'll just put out a teaser, is that for school-based wraparound, there's even another approach called Renew that has been developed in New Hampshire, which is very much a wraparound process, but it's specifically for high school students. And it really emphasizes helping youth be in charge of their plans, with families supporting them. And there's also a strong employment element. So wraparound is very broad, and it's used very differently across the country, and even in Vermont. It's not just school-based in Vermont. That's just one of the latest things that I've been working on with the trainings. So these are great questions. I'm going to try and answer them as they come, so please keep chiming in with those. So these are the 10 wraparound principles. I hope everybody can see them and they're not too washed out. I didn't necessarily want to go through every single one of them except to provide just a quick highlight, but for historically, this is how we've known what wraparound is and what it's not. So back in the 80s, as people were starting to offer wraparound really as an alternative to restrictive, intensive, often residential placements, or when therapeutic interventions were really failing, kids were often getting kicked out of school, kicked out of their homes, falling under the umbrella of child welfare, or many times with the juvenile justice system or the adult correction system. And so the idea was we needed an alternative to these really restrictive placements. And so wraparound was developed really as the hopeful answer to that. So if we could really provide that same level of intensity and support to a family engaged team process, could we prevent those more serious outcomes, like being incarcerated, from happening in the first place? And so in the 80s, it was really just people trying to do that on their own. And as the 80s progressed, these folks around the country, many in Vermont, some in Illinois, and Florida, there's several other camps around the country, they started to talk with each other more. And they came to consensus that wraparound really was these 10 things, or these 10 principles. So the extent to which the team is making sure these 10 things are happening, that's wraparound. And when you can't have all of these 10 things happening, it becomes less and less like wraparound. So there's voice and choice, and that's really focusing on the family and youth voice and choice. So to what extent are they leading the process? To what extent are they making all of the key decisions rather than other people are making the decisions for them? And that can be as concrete as, what their goals are. It can also be who's on the team. So is the family, are they getting the final say about who's on their team? Natural supports can be a confusing term, but really all it means is people that are not providers, people that are not professionals, that are paid to be there on the team to provide services. Natural supports can be other family members, it can be a neighbor, it can be friends, other peers. And the idea is, if we want our supports to be, our services to be effective and to work in the real world, if we've got a team of only of professionals, when the team's over, all of your supports have gone away. Whereas if during that process you've got friends and neighbors and other people that are really the champions of this child and family, and then when the wraparound team is done, they'll still be there. They'll still be involved with the family because they already were involved with the family. So it's really a way to ensure sustainability. Definitely already talked about team-based. It's a team-based process. Collaboration seems very obvious, although there's plenty of collaborative teams that I've been on that don't really work very well together. So there's a lot of skills that the facilitator needs to have in order to make sure people are working together. Strengths-based is one of my favorite principles, and it's one of my favorite because I think in Vermont, it's almost in our bones. I mean, I don't think there's been a team that I've ever participated on or a meeting that I've gone to where people haven't talked about the strengths of the kid or the youth and family members. And often it's done at the very beginning of the meeting, which is great. I think one of the places that we struggle, and one of the components that is supposed to be part of the wraparound process, is that it's not enough to just talk about the strengths. It's not enough to come up with a list of them. You have to use them. So the idea is we're meeting for a reason. We're meeting because there's pretty serious problems that we have not been able to address earlier than this. So we talk about the strengths not as just a way of bringing people in and forming a relationship. We're talking about the strengths because these are the actual things that are going to help us meet the needs. So being able to have a discussion about what is this child doing well in addition to where they're struggling, because where they're doing well is where we're going to start. That's what we're going to leverage in order to meet the needs. Community-based really just means that as much as possible, the service and supports are going to happen in natural settings. And to the extent that the array of supports that are identified are not just all professional services, but maybe if one of the goals is to help a youth do better and socially and make friends, and that's something that they've struggled with and seems to be a major challenge. Social skills groups can be very helpful if there's skills difficulties, but so can a karate class. Or just getting them out into a sports team, or again finding out what they like and what their strengths are, and then getting them connected to something in the community that everybody would have access to. Culturally competent is something that we want to have instilled in all of our services, and specific for wraparound, that's something that should be coming up early in the process. So what's important to the family? What are their beliefs? What are their traditions? What matters to them? Those are all things that a facilitator needs to find out at the beginning of the process so they can help make sure that the team is organized in a way that supports it rather than fighting against it. Individualized just means that it's going to be a different process for every child and family. So again, it's an organized series of steps that I'll talk about in a minute, but it's individualized based on the needs and the strengths of the kid and family. Unconditional is a tough one. It's a tough principle to adhere to, and it's almost more of an aspiration. Some people also talk about this in terms of persistence. And what it means is, and it's ideal, that no matter what, this is a team that's going to stick with this family, no matter what. So, plenty of times we run into constraints with funding or eligibility, or the school year ends, and it's now summer. So to what extent can we really say, if this family and child need us, if they want to continue this process, we're going to be there. Or even if they've stopped and they want to restart it, we'll be there. So it's a pretty tough principle to adhere to, and actually there's good data on that around the country that people struggle with that. But it is an important one. It's one of the main distinctions between wraparound and other types of team-based processes. And then finally, outcomes-based. Again, I think this is one of those principles that really should be part of lots of different services, not just wraparound. But during team meetings, the team should be reviewing data on how things are doing. So is the team making progress on their plan? If things are getting better, that's something to celebrate, and maybe a need becomes a strength that we can leverage to meet other kinds of needs. And also, if things aren't working so well, maybe we need to change our plan. We need to figure out something different. So that's the quick version of the 10 principles, and I'm sure that didn't feel very quick. I see that there's been a couple of questions or comments that have been written, so I'm going to take a look at those. But as you're thinking, as you're sort of digesting what I've just gone through, if you've got any questions about the specific principles, please type that in too. So let's see. Lots of good questions. So we read that one. So is Vermont collecting data about outcomes? And then I assume you're talking specifically about wraparound. And the answer is yes and no. Not in any comprehensive way yet. There's ways. Again, my main involvement with wraparound right now is with school-based PBIS wraparound, and there's measurement tools that we're offering and encouraging facilitators to use. But ultimately, that's one of the biggest challenges that folks find when they're trying to implement Wraparound is having the time to fill that out. And to use them regularly, and to be able to look at them in any terms of type of systematic look. There's other kinds of data that we have in schools right now that we haven't had an opportunity to look at that could be sort of indirectly related to Wraparound, and that's on the list of things that we want to do. There's also plenty of other providers around the state, and I've worked with NFI. That offer Wraparound, and there are some kinds of data that they collect, and I know that's also been a push with State Department of Mental Health to help mental health centers collect more standardized data. So I think in Vermont we're getting there. There's been a lot of development in that area. Nationally, there's one of the projects that I participated in was reviewing research on Wraparound outcomes, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But the national data is very promising on Wraparound working. What's the ideal number for a team? It's different for every team. There's a lot of good research on sort of team collaboration in general, and usually when you've got teams of about 8 or more than 8, it starts to get a little unwieldy. To just get everybody on the same page and collaborating, and just even practically have an opportunity to talk with each other during a team meeting. So usually we're recommending that teams are smaller than that. Can you share how many teams you have trained in Vermont? Wondering how many trained facilitators there are available. So so that's a great question, and I don't have that number offhand. There's been about 20 schools that have participated in Wraparound trainings, but our Wraparound trainings have changed a lot over the last few years. We really feel like the last year that we did our Wraparound facilitator training, which was just about a year ago, was one of the best trainings that we offered, just because it was really focused on facilitator skills. And even with that, not all of the schools were able to sort of hit the ground running when the school year started up in the fall to offer Wraparound, because it's a very big change to the services that people are offering. And one of the challenges is not just having somebody who's trained to do the approach, but for them to have the time in their day to offer Wraparound to the youth, and in this case the students that would be eligible for it. So given that, some of the schools are implementing and some of the schools are not, and I don't know the exact numbers on that. But again, that's one of the things that we're sort of, as more and more schools are trained in it, especially with the new training that really focuses on facilitator skills, we want to help develop a community of practice around that, where the facilitators can use each other to help beef up their own skills, but then also to help raise awareness about kind of who's out there with this. It's still a pretty small group right now. Again, there are NFI and other mental health centers that I know of, and there also might be other agencies that I don't know of that have trained facilitators that offer Wraparound. Keep those questions coming. So what I'm going to talk about now is just a little bit of historical context, moving us into how does Wraparound work. So as I'm doing that, keep thinking about, again, your experiences with Wraparound and also your questions, and then just as they come up, feel free to type them in. So this was the original belief as I was describing it, right? So in the 80s, folks came together and they decided these are the 10 things that make up Wraparound. So if you do those 10 things, this is what will happen. Well, a miracle happens, and we'll all have a party when it's over, because that's all you need to do. If you're doing all of these 10 things, the team's going to have a great time, and we're going to solve everybody's problems. At that stage in Wraparound's history, it wasn't really developed in terms of sort of what's happening in the actual Wraparound process to lead us to these good outcomes. So I've already mentioned the National Wraparound Initiative, and I'm going to mention them a lot because I think they have really developed themselves as a great resource, particularly for families and providers. So they have lots of great users guides. They've got ones, actually the first guide that they ever came up with, which is still my favorite, was written specifically for families that were going to be participating in the wraparound process. And so I'm actually going to do my best in a little bit to show you where that is on the website, and definitely encourage everybody to download at least that guide, because they can go into more detail in a really family-friendly way about what wraparound is, and then it also has some recommendations for how families can participate in an engaged way on wraparound teams. And that's me leading up to the end of the presentation, which is how you can avoid the runaround. I think that's really your best strategy, is having families that are engaged in the process and can educate themselves and the providers about what good high-fidelity wraparound is. So what I've got in front of you is just a few of the things that the National Wraparound Initiative has been working on since it came together in 2003. So one was trying to gain just consensus, not on what the 10 principles are in terms of those labels, but what do they mean? What do they look like when they're actually happening with a given team? And so there's a whole nother user's guide specifically on the principles of wraparound, and it tries to give much better and more specific definitions than I was able to give you just in the short time that we have together. So I encourage folks to look at that. They've also tried to unpack what is this process of wraparound. So that's actually the next thing that I'm going to talk about, is the phases of wraparound. And there's 4 specific and organized phases that every wraparound team should go through, even as they're individualizing everything for different kids. Identifying community supports. This has been another big push, because one of the things that we found is wraparound really is what's happening at a team level with one family and often just one or a few children. But what we're finding is it's so hard to just train a facilitator and send them out there and say, okay, go do good wraparound without supports from the community. So there's been a lot of people have worked on trying to identify just what some of those community supports are. So I'm going to highlight some of those, but that's also something that we emphasize in our trainings for school-based PBIS. So you've got a facilitator in your school that's trying to provide wraparound, but what supports does the school need to provide that facilitator so they can be effective? What kinds of support does the district or the supervisory union or even the state need to provide so people can do good wraparound? And then the last one, creating family-friendly resources. I already mentioned the Family Users Guide is just fantastic. So that's the link. I'm going to put it up a few times. It'll also be the last slide, so everyone should be able to go there. Again, I can't recommend them strongly enough. So these are the 4 phases of wraparound. They were actually supposed to appear one at a time, but they didn't, so ta-da. I'm going to actually see quickly if there's any other questions. No, so no new questions about the principles. So I'm going to push on about the phases. So like I said, there's 4 unique phases of wraparound. So the first is engagement and team preparation. And I think this is one of the things that really differentiates wraparound from a lot of other kinds of team-based approaches. Often the first time you have a meeting or a conversation about most kinds of teams, the whole team is there. And so I think one of the team models that I'm the most familiar with is Act 264, or the coordinated services planning process. And I participated in some of those where they had to secure big conference rooms to get everybody, to get the whole team there at the same time. So I'm picturing more than 20 people around a team. And the first question to the family is, so do you want to participate on this team? Here's the face sheet that you need to sign to give us permission to have this team meeting. It's really too late. There's, some families under that kind of pressure might feel like they can actually say, you know what, I don't know what this is, and I don't want to give permission. But I think most folks would plow ahead just because everybody's already there. And so that's what this engagement and team preparation phase is. It's really a series of conversations that the facilitator is having with people separately, primarily with the family, to introduce them to this, to see if this is something they want to try, and then starting to do some of that culturally competent and strengths-based wraparound to listen to the family story. What's been their experience so far? What has worked for them on previous teams? What has not worked for them on other teams? What do they want to work on now? What are their goals? What are their dreams? What are their big picture hopes? And from that, try and form a big vision. So 5 years from now, how do you want things to be for your child? So let's start positive. Let's start big. And then from that vision, you work backwards. So if we're going to get there, who are the people that need to be on your team? And so it's all with this initial conversation, or many conversations really, with the family, without a whole team present, because this is the process where you identify who the team's going to be. As the family does that, the team would then, or the facilitator would then go off and meet with those potential team members. And maybe they don't know anything about Wraparound, so they need to be introduced to how this is going to be different from other kinds of teams. Maybe they were on the special education team, and they need to understand how this is different. And how this is going to be working on maybe related but different goals, and definitely with a different process. So there's this whole phase where, I'm picturing our training right now for facilitators. We spend, I would say, almost half of our time on the skills necessary for facilitators to be successful in this engagement and team preparation phase, primarily because it's something that just in most fields we're not taught how to do. So there's a question just came up. Are you saying you meet with other team members separately from the family? That's a fantastic question, and possibly, but not without the family's permission. And so what you would be doing is meeting with the family first to find out, like I said, who are team members that they might like to have involved. The ideal situation would be the facilitator and the family would work together, so the family is the one that's actually reaching out to those team members. And maybe they want the facilitator there, and maybe they don't want the facilitator there. I mean, that's really the facilitator's role, is to find out what the family wants and to help deliver that in a process that's consistent with these principles and phases of Wraparound. So a lot of times, just in my experience, and that was the example I was giving earlier and why you asked that question, there's plenty of times that a family doesn't want to be doing that, either because it's just legwork and they've got lots of other meetings that they need to attend to, or there's people that they want to invite to the team that they may not have a relationship with yet. And so they'd ask the facilitator to do that for them. But it's very much doing it for them, and the facilitator shouldn't be going out and just identifying team members and talking to them on their own without the family, one, being aware of it, and two, giving permission for it. Great question. So again, please, I'm gonna keep going ahead, but please keep jumping in with questions, because I know I'm doing this pretty quickly. Then there's this planning phase. So now the team's been formed, and you finally have kind of that initial team meeting. In a lot of ways, this probably looks similar to other kinds of team meetings. So when you do finally have everybody around the table, I think one of the main differences is the family's already had some time to think about their vision statement, and also what their goals are, and started to think about some of their strengths and needs. Again, the ideal situation for the way a meeting like this would be kicked off is the family is presenting it themselves. So they're talking about, this is what we want to work on. This is where we're trying to get to. These are the specific big needs that we're interested in. And I use that term, big needs. It's something I've taken from Lucille Eber, who does school-based wraparound in Illinois, who we based our school-based wraparound model in Vermont on. And by big needs, she's talking about goals that aren't, reduce the number of suspensions or reduce the amount of biting that's occurring during the school day, which is often something that we see as a specific goal or specific objective in kind of a traditional plan. A big need is I need my son to graduate from high school. I need my son to be accepted by his peers. I need my son to have a safe and stable place to live. Those are big needs. And the thing about big needs is they're things that all of us need. And then, so then they would be related to the vision. And then what you can do is from there you get more specific with objectives. But starting with those big needs helps get everybody on the same page. And it's not until you've got that you can start to identify what are the specific services and supports that are going to help meet those big needs. I'm seeing another couple of questions here, which is great. Do you mean sign consent to talk to providers during team preparation? Yeah, I mean at a very basic level, we anytime that we're going to talk about a family with somebody else, we need their signed permission. So absolutely, that would be part of that. There is not a separate set of consent forms for Wraparound versus others. So whatever consent forms or release forms that you already use, you'd be using them as part of this process. So who's ever taking the lead, it would be their forms. What do you do when a family gets very overwhelmed during the engagement team prep phase? Oh, good question. Maybe due to having some large team, or maybe organizational time management isn't family members' strength. So one of the major purposes of the engagement phase is to avoid sort of families feeling overwhelmed. So if you skip the engagement phase and again jump into that team meeting where you've got lots of providers and lots of people around the room and they're sort of ready to go and they've got limited time, in my experience, that can be much more overwhelming. The purpose of the engagement phase is to go at the family speed. And these aren't even, we even try not to talk about them as meetings. These are conversations that you're having at the beginning where the family is really, they're kicking the tires of the wraparound process. The facilitator's explaining it to them, but it's going to be up to the family to decide whether they want to try this or not. And if they do, they get to choose the speed. So I think, again, in my experience, I've had the opposite experience, that families are feeling much more comfortable starting this kind of team process because time is taken at the beginning to make sure that they're comfortable. And is there an ideal age range for students who are successfully supported by Wraparound? At what age is the student included in the team? There's really no hard and fast rules. I see a lot of people sort of use the age of 11, and I don't know the origin of that particular chronological age. I think to meet the principles of Wraparound, the child should be involved and they should have a voice in the process. Ideally, that would mean that they're attending team meetings and that they even they get to talk and they get to share what's on their mind in team meetings. Not everybody can do that. So if somebody's feeling uncomfortable doing that, outside of the team meeting, they could work with the facilitator to figure out what's the best way that their voice is heard. Do they want the facilitator to share it? Do they want to write it down? Maybe they don't want to attend the meeting, but they want to share their feedback in some other ways. Maybe they want to, with their family, have decision-making power outside of the team meeting. So the team is more of sort of a brainstorming session. There's lots of ways of doing it. And there's no hard and fast rules because, all kids are different. So it doesn't mean when you suddenly turn 11 that you should be participating on teams or that if you're younger than 11, you can't. I think that's something the team needs to problem solve during the engagement phase for how the youth voice is going to be heard. Implementation in a lot of ways is very similar to other kinds of team meetings. So we're going to meet as often as necessary. Often it's more frequent at the beginning because we brought together this team for a reason, and it's because something's not working. So we need to meet pretty regularly to see if we're making progress, and if we're not, to change the plan. So we need to be fairly flexible in our plan. And then the fourth phase, transition, I think is something that's pretty unique to Wraparound as well, because it's really kind of like the first phase. It's taking time that teams often don't. So teams often meet just until either eligibility runs out, the money runs out, or there's been some consensus that we've met our goals, or that we're not going to meet our goals, and so we just need to stop. So the transition phase is saying, okay, so we've met our goals, at least temporarily. Can we take a little time, or we should take a little time, to unwrap from this? Let's celebrate, but let's also talk about, okay, so we might only be temporarily meeting the goals, and definitely haven't reached our 5-year vision because we haven't met for 5 years yet. How will we know if it's time to meet again? How will we know if it's time to bring together the team again? So kind of setting that plan in place for transition out of Wraparound, and then also possibly back into Wraparound if it's needed down the road. I'm not going to go through this whole slide, but this is basically just this is the Positive Behavior Intervention Supports School Pyramid that just basically shows who's getting Wraparound. And so the process I've described probably sounds like it's a lot of work and it takes a lot of time, and you would be right if you're thinking that. And so it's not something that we can offer to everybody. In fact, the idea is that there's really only about 1 to 5% of kids that need something this intensive. Again, remember this was developed as an alternative to much more restrictive residential placements or incarceration or something like that. So it doesn't mean that you can't use elements of this in just regular team meetings, but just in terms of if you're going to offer all of those principles and all 4 of those phases as part of a wraparound, it's going to take a lot of time. And so all this graph or this picture is showing you here is that in a typical school, it's only about 1 to 5% of students would be receiving wraparound. So I'm going to go ahead because there's more things about wraparound I want to get to. If there's questions about PBIS and wraparound that we want to address, I'm happy to come back to that. So I promised that I was going to talk about what's wraparound and what's the runaround or what's not wraparound. And one thing I want to be careful to say is there's nothing wrong with not getting wraparound. So traditional teams can be amazingly effective. Wraparound is just a higher level of intensity and collaboration and often family engagement than traditional teams. It doesn't mean that traditional teams are in any way bad. It just means that sometimes, and for some families and kids, you need more. You need to do more. And so that's why I'm trying to make the distinction between the 2 of these. Where I use the term runaround, it's when people are saying you're getting wraparound, but you're not. And it's either because it's not following those phases or you're not getting all of those principles. So here there's just a few sort of touchstone points that I wanted to highlight the difference between wraparound and a traditional team. And I think some of these that I've probably already talked about, so I just want to emphasize them here. So getting started in the process, again, there's that engagement phase, which is very different from traditional teams. The provider might meet with youth and families separately before a team comes together, but it's really for sort of an intake process rather than to develop a vision. I've talked about this a little bit already too, so how the team is actually formed. In wraparound, it's the family and youth that are identifying everybody that's going to be on their team. And one thing I didn't emphasize, at least I don't think so yet, is that ideally half of the team should represent natural supports. So that's friends, family, maybe a coach, maybe a neighbor. So not just a team of the family and all professionals, which is much more common for a traditional team. And then, again, I told you I really like identifying strengths. And here, again, same distinction. So traditional teams typically either aren't talking about them. I think in Vermont we do a great job of talking about them, but we don't always use them to address the needs. A couple specific things, and I think I've already mentioned these, but feel free to ask other questions if there's things that you're wondering are wraparound or not. But I emphasize again, wraparound is a process. It's not a service or a set of services. It doesn't happen just once or twice. So if a team comes together, comes up with a plan, and never meets again, that's not wraparound. It's also not a special education evaluation. Certainly special education team meetings can follow the principles or a process of wraparound, but typically don't, and so it doesn't mean that you're getting wraparound if you have a comprehensive team like a special education team. It's not an individual counselor who's meeting with a family or student or youth. The next point, only for families and children is judged as, quote, workable. That's something that we put in there just for providers that we work with and for our training there, because sometimes, because this is such a family-intensive process, and you really are giving the family the steering wheel for so much of this, some providers get concerned about doing that with all families. And one of the things that we emphasize is wraparound can be really great for those families that you don't have a good relationship with when they are not engaged, because this is really a full team or a full court press. I'm mixing my metaphors, and I apologize for that. But this is really an effort to engage families in the process. So those families that that you don't have a good relationship with might be the very ones that you want to emphasize with, or you want to try wraparound with. And it's not the presence of flexible funds. Sometimes we talk about high-end wraparound, or flexible funds wraparound, and often, usually, what that means is that there's been some pool of money or some flexibility in services that could be offered to kids that are at really high risk, and really all they're getting is that flexibility. They're not really getting a team process necessarily, and they're not necessarily getting wraparound. They could get wraparound, but sometimes that's called wraparound, and it doesn't include a lot of the things that we've talked about. I think a lot of this is probably pretty clear in terms of who benefits from it. And my main point here is it's when you're trying to figure out who you'd want to work with, it's, I already mentioned families that are not engaged, but it's kids and youth that have needs that are really in more than one domain. So there's things that are not going so well at home, school, and in the community. And one of the things that the last bullet there, agencies through climate change. I think it's a really exciting thing when some people are trained in the wraparound process in schools or other kinds of agencies, because there's all of those wraparound principles that they're trying to apply. Even if they're not providing full wraparound to everybody that they're working with, they can get kind of hooked on some of these principles. So like identifying strengths and actually using them in a plan is something that could be used, I think, a lot more frequently. And doesn't have to just happen in a wraparound process. Okay, I put the slide in here to make sure that I took a breath and gave an opportunity to see if people have any questions at this point. All right, and so there's a few questions already. These are great. Have you seen wraparound used successfully with students coming out of crisis settings like Brattleboro Retreat? I think that's a great time to think about doing wraparound. Even better time would be before. And not even necessarily that it can prevent all crises. I mean, part of the engagement phase, and it's one of the parts that I didn't mention, but is to identify, what are the crises, or what are the risks for a crisis happening, and helping the family develop a proactive safety plan and crisis plan. But think about a scenario where a wraparound team has met before a residential placement was necessary. So you've built, you're starting to build all of these supports. You're starting to identify, some good goals and some strategies for meeting those goals. And then a crisis occurs, and let's say Brattleboro Retreat is necessary at that point. The team shouldn't go away. The team is there. They should be coordinating with Brattleboro Retreat in your example to find out what are they learning there and what are some things that we're going to continue. I think all too often services, and this is really driven by a lot of our funding structures, is services stop. Or the services that you're getting before you go to a residential center stop as you go to a residential center, and then they sort of start up again after you come back. The wraparound team really could provide that kind of sustainability or continuity from the before and after. So again, I think it can be very helpful for that. Wow, a lot of questions here. Can you talk about what it might look like through the discharge process? This is often a high-stress time for families. It can be extremely overwhelming. I think, I'm looking at the time and thinking about the other things that we want to get to at the end. If you want to email me that question, I'd be happy to give you a more thorough answer. I think in general, I think the benefit of wraparound is it can help, because you're putting the family in charge immediately after a situation when they absolutely had no control over what was going on. I think it can be very therapeutic for that. And so that's the short answer. Who usually suggests a wraparound team? School personnel, family members? It can be either. I think that's a great strategy for families to use. And one of the things that I wanted to get to in terms of how you can avoid getting the runaround is talk to your providers. Do they offer wraparound? And if they do, how do they describe wraparound? Does it sound like what we've talked about today? For schools that have been trained in wraparound, they are certainly reaching out to families that they want to try it out with. So I don't think it has to be just one direction there. It should be both. Would you expect the need for wraparound to be reduced when Vermont fully implements multi-tiered system of supports? That's the hope, right? And so if we've got a good functioning system that's providing good supports to improve the health and well-being of all youth in schools, all students, then there should be fewer that become at risk that need sort of group interventions or interventions as high need as wraparound. And I think that's one of the ways that a wraparound can work so well with school-wide PBIS is if you're doing the whole school-wide PBIS effectively, there will be fewer students who need this high-intensity support. And with fewer students, you'll have more time to support those students. So you can do a much more comprehensive wraparound for those that need it. The pitfall is if you try and start providing wraparound to everybody, you're not going to be able to do it very effectively or very comprehensively. What are the biggest challenges with growing and improving wraparound in Vermont? That's a very big question. I've talked about some of them already. We might have to come back to that at the end if we still have time. We'll be offering a facilitator training for mental health providers. I don't do that yet, but I do. I'm starting to collaborate more with NFI, and that is something that their staff is trying to implement wraparound, and they are starting to provide trainings around the state. Specifically on wraparound, and they're aware of this national model as well. So it's something they've been doing for many, many years, and they're trying to do better. That's one of the ways that this is expanding around the state. I think, and maybe this addresses the big challenge question too. Because anybody really can call anything wraparound, it's really hard to get a good sense of sort of who's doing high fidelity wraparound. And so that's something that we're trying to work with both on the mental health side and the school side to do a better job of identifying sort of who's out there that's doing this well already, so we can make that information more easily available for everyone. And what questions might a family want to ask before they decide to engage in wraparound? That's a great question. Let me hold it for when we get to what are some of the strategies that families can use to get wraparound and not the runaround. I'm putting up this question, and again, I'm looking at the clock, so we've got a little over 5 minutes, maybe 6 minutes. Oh, and I'm hearing that. I'm hearing that if we want, we can actually go to 10 minutes after time. So if folks have the time and want to stay a little bit longer, I'm happy to do that because we're getting a lot of good questions, and I'd like to answer as many of them on the webinar as I can. So this question, I was actually planning on skipping because it seems like a lot of folks are starting to ask questions related to what can we do to make this better, and I'd love to jump to that conversation. But I am going to put this up to see if anybody wants to respond to this. So how is wraparound similar and different from services and teams that either you've been on or that you know about in Vermont? So I'm going to put that up there and to see if anybody wants to respond. Again, I'm getting more questions about sort of what we can do, so I am going to go ahead with that. But again, I would love to hear sort of what people's experiences have been in Vermont, because I think that's part of what's going to help us understand how to move this forward. So someone wrote, different in that families, youth are at the center of the team. Yeah, that's a big focus. Or possibly the core focus of what wraparound is all about is making sure that it's, I always get this backward, but child-centered and family-focused, or family-centered and child-focused, or however you want to work at that. But that's definitely the core and that first principle of family voice and choice. So this is just our roadmap again. We did introductions. Hopefully we got a little bit of better understanding of what wraparound is and what it's not. And then I've got, I'm laughing because I'm picturing the next slide, which is very complicated and could take a long time to unpack. With that great upsell in mind, I'm going to put it up and try and give you the simple version of how we think wraparound works these days. This is the theory of change of wraparound. And what I'm not going to do is read this to you, and I am not going to have you read it fully. So this, again, this whole webinar is being saved, so you will have access to this slide. It'll be on YouTube, and then also at the very top of the page, I've put a link to where you can get the resource guide that explains what the theory of change is of wraparound. So it's at the National Wraparound Initiative. This is not something that I created. But that's why I put the logo there, and then the link is at the very top of the page. I don't know if folks can see my pointer there, but if you go to their website, and actually I'm hoping to show you their website in just a minute, so I can show you how to easily access this stuff. But it's a great guide that explains sort of our current understanding of how wraparound works. And actually, I'm going to try and I think I've got a drawing tool. I've got a highlighter. I'm going to try and just make this process a little bit simpler. Basically, what this graphic is showing you is that if you're doing the 10 principles of wraparound, wow, that's an exciting circle, and you're also using the 4 phases of wraparound successfully, this is what your wraparound process will look like. It will be of high quality. There'll be strong respect for families and culture. There'll be lots of opportunities for choice. It'll be high fidelity wraparound. So that's what we mean, is when you've got a wraparound process that's really including all of these elements, that's what we mean by high fidelity wraparound. And there's also measures out there that can be used to interview families and providers to see if it's consistent with high fidelity wraparound. The idea is if you do all of that, you're going to get some good short-term outcomes. So you're going to have a team that's following through on decision makings. The services and supports that they identify are going to be a good fit to the goals and needs of the family. Services are going to be coordinated better because they're working collaboratively on this team. The family and the providers are going to have high satisfaction with engagement. And all of this is going to be building experiences of efficacy and success. And all efficacy means is the family is going to start to feel better about this is something that they can do. It's going to be boosting their confidence, and they're going to start to be feeling more positive about this process. And so that's what's going to be happening immediately if wraparound's working well. And so you can see the little arrow that leads from high quality wraparound to that box there of those short-term outcomes. At the same time, something else is going to be happening directly, which is wraparound, again, is not a service. It's a way of having these team meetings. So at the same time, the team's still identifying specific services and interventions that they're going to offer. So maybe special education is part of that. Maybe cognitive behavioral therapy is part of that. Maybe a trauma-informed mental health treatment is part of that. So all of those different services are still happening at the same time. And so the idea is if you've got good wraparound, then that's going to, actually I drew the wrong arrow, that's up here. So that's going to enhance the effectiveness of those services and supports. And one of the main ways that it does that is it's engaging the family and the youth in a process and it puts them in charge. A lot of times, and I know this is true for most mental health interventions, we can get people in for a single visit, but they don't come back. And it's because they didn't get what they were looking for in the first visit. And they're just incredibly busy, and they probably have lots of other kinds of services and team meetings that they need to go to. So if we've got a good, solid wraparound team process, that in and of itself is also going to improve the services that are being offered. And then there's lots of other kinds of sort of intermediate outcomes that are happening with the child and family, both in terms of increasing their social support, getting those goals met, and then also the long-term outcomes. So stable living placements, improved mental health outcomes, improved functioning at school and the community, that team mission and vision that folks developed at the very start of wraparound is being met, and then also improving the strengths and resiliency and quality of life. So I lied. I said I wasn't going to go through the whole thing, and I did. But the main idea here, I think the simple idea here, is that if you've got good wraparound, it leads to good outcomes in two ways. One, directly by having a positive and family-engaged team process leads to good outcomes, even if you weren't providing any services. And two, because you're having a good wraparound process, you're identifying better services. You're identifying services that are better matched to the needs of the family, and that's going to make those services work better. So it's those two things that are part of our theory of change for how and why wraparound works. So again, it's a great guide. It goes into it in a lot more detail, and if you're looking to understand how wraparound works, I can't recommend that enough. So I see some people are leaving right now. Thank you so much for your participation and your questions. For folks that want to stay on a little bit longer, I'd be happy to answer questions. Oh, and somebody asked for a link to the guide. I'm going to see if I have to get out of my highlighter mode. Oh, and my highlighting is still there. That's pretty funny. I can draw on this person's face. Erase all drawings. I think I got it. There we go. Let me skip to that slide because I know some people have to go. And I want to, well, here, let me just, if this works, I will go online. So if you go to the National Wraparound Initiative, which is nwi.pdx.edu, again, the link is in the webinar as well, and you go to publications, a lot of the publications that I've been talking about today are just under this link. So the last one was the theory of change I was just talking about. There's also the 10 principles, the phases and activities. The family guide is right here. It's the user's guide, and I've got that up right here. So it's the Wraparound Process User's Guide. It's a handbook for families. It's just great. I think it's one of the best things that the National Wraparound Initiative has put out there. And so it's a great way, if you're a facilitator of the wraparound process, it's a great way to introduce families to it. So it's something you could give to all families right at the outset, just so they know what they're in for, and so families can decide whether they want to do this or not, and then help them be prepared and engaged in the process. So that's where that lives. And again, if folks will have my contact information from the email that you receive, and it's also in the webinar. If there's any of these things that you can't find, just feel free to email me directly. All right, so folks that are still with us, should we see if anybody's still with us? Or should I just keep going? I'm happy to keep going. I'm asking Kathleen right now. There are still people here. Wonderful. So keep those questions coming in. So all those boxes are fun for us researchers to understand the theory of change, but there's really a couple simple things that it comes down to too. You have to have a trained and skilled facilitator in order to make this work, and that should be pretty obvious at this point based on the number of things that have to be done. The facilitator is really the one that helps guide the family and the team through this organized force phase process. And so as people are trying to identify who would be a good potential facilitator, somebody who has experience working with kids that are struggling, somebody that is a good track record of working with families, somebody who collaborates with not just professionals, but also natural supports. So again, have they been able to get, a coach or a friend or other family members to come to team meetings in the past? Obviously, they have to understand and be able to follow the wraparound process and principles and use data. And again, from one of our earlier questions, it's something that we're still struggling with and trying to do better. And then another thing, if I can get it to come up here, great, is, and I mentioned this before, but you need to have good community supports. So if you've got a facilitator and a team, you can do wraparound without other kinds of supports, but it can be so much easier and so much more effective if you've got good community supports. So again, I mentioned that in schools, we're working with school leadership teams and also supervisory union level teams to try and provide some of these supports so wraparound is more effective. And it's things like having a higher level team that can look at sort of what are the resources and needs in the community or school so they can provide that. The team should be meeting regularly, just like a wraparound team meetings, but we need a community team to be meeting regularly to be thinking about, okay, how are we going to address some of the needs that are getting in the way of us doing good wraparound? And then some of these other things might be obvious or they might not be, but making sure that you've got a funding structure in place that can pay for a facilitator, can pay for the time for a facilitator to offer these intensive level services, access to other kinds of service and supports. I think you can get a lot of benefit from just doing a wraparound process, but typically it's not enough. Again, this is just a way of running team meetings and going through this organized process outside of teams. It's not a specific service. So if a specific service and support is needed, and I think in most cases they are, you need to have access to those in your community. Otherwise, wraparound's not going to be as effective. Human resources is just you need to have the right people in place, and they need to have the right training, and you need to have a system that can look at outcomes and data. And again, that's something that we're struggling with. Here's a really boring slide that just basically what I'm showing here is this is a study that I did with a colleague, and what it is trying to show you is the relative outcomes of all of the studies that actually compared youth receiving wraparound to youth receiving typical services. And what these bars represent are all positive outcomes in different areas for the youth that are receiving wraparound compared to those receiving typical services. So if one of these bars was a 0, that would mean there's no difference between wraparound and the other what the other youth were getting. So higher bars mean there's a bigger difference and it's in favor of wraparound. And so the dotted lines in the back, I don't know if folks can see my pointer or not, but there's one that's around 0.2, there's one that's around 0.5, and there's one that's around 0.8. Those are just sort of rules of thumb in terms of what's sort of a small positive difference, what's a medium positive difference, and what's a large positive difference. So most of these positive effects for wraparound compared to traditional services are in sort of the small to medium range. And that's pretty in keeping with some of the best research that's out there for other kinds of mental health interventions. They're all in about this range too. So I think a little more importantly what this is saying is that research has shown that wraparound can have positive effects for safe and stable living situations, so for finding that for families and kids, for improving mental health symptoms, for improving how kids are doing academically at school, and then also this justice involvement is basically usually that's measured by reduced involvement with the justice system. So that can be anything from being stopped by police or arrested to being incarcerated to recidivism, so returning to jail. So positive outcomes for all of those is the take-home message from this. So I'm going to pause again to see if there's any questions before I move into the last couple sections, or the last section. All right. I'm gonna get to the last section, but if you've already started typing a question, I promise we will see it and we will answer it. But just back to the roadmap. Here we are, making sure that you're not getting the runaround. Seeing that it's almost 10, I'm going to skip past this question to just give you a couple of strategies. And I think the first strategy should be pretty obvious based on what I've already talked about. Go to the National Wraparound Initiative website. They have so many resources. And I think that's one of the most effective strategies you can use to avoid getting the runaround, is to learn what wraparound is and what's being offered around, and then sharing that with other families and with providers. So the Wraparound Process User's Guide, a handbook for families, was on that website, and then you saw the links for these other three. So I've been using them to help create this presentation, and I think they would be they are very helpful for both families and for providers to find out what wraparound is and sharing that with others. And then, and this is true for any kind of intervention, but families can always improve outcomes if they're engaged in the process. I mean, this is even true of healthcare. There's been great research on showing how folks can have better medical outcomes if they're engaged with their doctors and then they learn about the procedures that they're going to participate in. So being prepared for meetings. So even before wraparound starts, and this is something I got from the Family User's Guide, the family could already be thinking about, what are the strengths of my child and family? Who are the important people in my life? What are the goals that I have that I want to work on this process? Those are all things that you could do even before you meet with the facilitator. And again, I think that would be something that would be helpful even if you're not doing wraparound. Talk with your provider. Communication is so key. What's worked for you in the past? What hasn't worked for you on previous teams? Again, even if you're not receiving wraparound, this is a fantastic place to start and to make sure that whatever new process or team that you're going to be working on is going in the direction that you want it to be, or at least isn't making the same mistakes the previous teams have. Give your child voice. So this is something that, I already talked about a little bit because a question came up about it. But I assume that I'm primarily talking to parents and families on this webinar, so you are in the best position to make sure that your child has a voice on the wraparound team. It might be attending meetings, it might not be attending meetings, but work with your facilitator to find out what would be the best way to have his or her voice at the team. And then speak out, be an advocate, and I may be preaching to the choir for folks that are participating in a Vermont Family Network webinar, but this is an excellent strategy. So if you see someone getting the runaround and not wraparound, but it's called wraparound, speak out, share the materials that you've learned, send them to me. I think this is something that we can only improve if we work on it together. Vermont has a very powerful and rich history with doing wraparound, but what we don't have is a lot of structure around it, and I think that's a good thing because it's allowed it to develop naturally. Which I think gives it a lot more credit with families and communities. The downside is there's some things that are being called wraparound that are just not wraparound, so speak out. Obviously, feel free to ask questions. The main thing I'm just rushing to is I want to make sure everybody's got my contact information. They've got the link for the National Wraparound Initiative, and then I'm also putting up the link for Vermont PBIS, which is the school-based approaches where I do trainings on wraparound. So this is the slide I'm going to leave up to make sure people have this information, and then just put in one final request for, but I'm going to read something in just a second, but I want to put in one final request that you're going to get an email in about a week. So please fill out that training evaluation. It would be very helpful to me, and I'd love to get your feedback. So as you're thinking about any final questions you might have, thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar is going to be archived on the Vermont Family Network's website, along with many others previously recorded webinars. And be sure to visit the Family Network website at www.vermontfamilynetwork.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars, workshops, and support groups. Have a good day, and thank you very much for your participation.